On December 26, 1991, Anatoly Lukyanov read the declaration announcing the end of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as a geopolitical reality and a subject of international law, ceases to exist. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics officially collapsed. Its dissolution gave birth to 15 independent nations. Among them, Russia was recognized as the legal successor to the Soviet Union, retaining its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council and most of its nuclear arsenal. Since the establishment of the Russian Federation in 1991, the country has had 3 presidents. Among them, Vladimir Putin has held power the longest and is credited with reviving Russia's economy from the brink of collapse. Some people step into the light of the political stage, while others rise from the shadows, where no one truly understands who they are. Vladimir Putin is one of them. From a child raised in a poor communal apartment in Leningrad, to a silent KGB agent during the Cold War. And then, in Russia's most chaotic moment, he emerged, cold, quiet, yet deeply calculating. They call him the most unpredictable man in the world. To the Russian people, he is a symbol of strength and pride. To the West, he is an unsolvable riddle. This is not just the story of a president, but the journey of a man who turned power into belief, and belief into a force that made the whole world look his way. The life of Vladimir Putin, from the shadows of the KGB to the throne of power. In 1952, Russia had not yet fully recovered from the wounds of war. The city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, still bore the scars of years under siege, hunger, and death. In a small, damp communal apartment tucked deep within a narrow alley, a boy named Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born. Few could have imagined that this child would one day become the man who revived and restored Russia. Putin's father, Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, was a Red Army veteran, a man who had fought to defend Leningrad during World War II. He was seriously wounded in battle, nearly losing his life, but survived and returned home to work in a factory. Putin's mother, Maria Ivanovna Shelemova, was a gentle and quiet woman. She worked in a factory and later as a cleaner, living simply, speaking little, and always putting her family above all else. They lived in a single small room, barely 20 square meters, sharing a kitchen and bathroom with several other families, peeling walls, damp ceilings, freezing winters. Yet in young Vladimir's eyes, that was his whole world. He once recalled, "We had nothing except the sense of dignity and discipline my parents taught me." Putin's childhood had no fancy toys, no treasured books. But he possessed something far more powerful, the will to survive. At that time, Leningrad was a place where children had to learn how to defend themselves if they wanted to stay alive. Putin once said that as a boy, he often got into street fights, not because he enjoyed them, but because if he didn't fight, he would be beaten. It was through those street brawls that he learned his first life lesson: when you fight, fight to the end. If you start something, never back down. Yet behind that tough exterior was a quiet, introverted boy who preferred to observe rather than speak. He was fascinated by detective stories, especially tales about Soviet spies and intelligence agents. In young Putin's mind, spies were not villains, they were heroes, silently protecting their homeland from the shadows. So when his teacher asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he answered without hesitation, "I want to be a secret agent." Everyone laughed. No one believed that a poor boy from a cramped apartment could ever join the elite ranks of the KGB, but to Putin, that wasn't a dream, it was a goal. And to reach it, he began to discipline himself, learning judo, practicing patience, self-control, and never letting his emotions show on his face. From the rough streets of Leningrad, young Vladimir Putin began to build a cold, composed facade, one that would later become his greatest weapon throughout his entire life. In 1975, when Russia was still known as the Soviet Union, Vladimir Putin, a young law graduate from Leningrad State University, quietly submitted his application to the organization he had dreamed of joining since childhood, the KGB. For many, the KGB was a terrifying institution, a place where those who served the state could make anyone disappear without a sound. But for Putin, it was a symbol of order, power, and absolute loyalty to the motherland. He underwent strict training, learning to observe, to remember even the smallest details, to control every emotion, and to act only when completely certain. At the KGB, Putin wasn't big or particularly noticeable, but he possessed something others lacked: patience. He understood that in the world of spies, the winner is not the strongest, but the one who can wait the longest without revealing anything. After years of domestic work, Putin was assigned to East Germany, specifically to the city of Dresden, where the Soviet Union maintained an intelligence base during the Cold War. There, he was no longer just an ordinary Soviet citizen, but a man in the shadows, a spy behind the walls dividing East and West. Putin worked in Dresden from 1985 to 1990, under the cover of a cultural attaché. His duties included gathering intelligence, monitoring Western espionage activities, and at times, persuading, recruiting, or manipulating people. He once said, "In this profession, you can never completely trust anyone. You must look into their eyes, not listen to their words." The years in Dresden shaped the man he would become. In a place where every mistake could cost a life, Putin learned three things: stay silent, observe, and strike at the right moment. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In Dresden, an angry crowd stormed toward the KGB headquarters, shouting, smashing, demanding liberation. Putin, then just a mid-level officer, stood amidst the chaos. He called Moscow for instructions. But on the other end of the line came only one response: Moscow is silent. No orders. No backup. He burned all the intelligence files, then stepped outside, to face the mob. Alone, unarmed, he said, "This building belongs to the Soviet Union. If anyone enters, I will order to shoot." And strangely enough, the crowd stopped. No one dared to take another step. That night, Dresden was quiet, but inside Putin, something had collapsed. The Soviet Union, the country he had served, the pride he had believed in, was crumbling piece by piece, and he realized, every empire, no matter how mighty, eventually falls silent. A few months later, he returned to Leningrad, no longer a spy, no longer a man of the KGB. He had no money, no position, no future. Only the memories of a man who had once lived in the shadows. Yet perhaps, in that moment of seeming despair, the strongest weapon within him was forged: the ability to wait. From the darkness of the KGB, Vladimir Putin learned that sometimes, the greatest power does not lie in action, but in silence. And from that very darkness, a man would one day emerge, to seize the power of an entire nation. When the Soviet Union collapsed, millions of Russians lost their faith, their jobs, and their future. But amid the ruins, Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, quietly searched for a new path. He returned to Leningrad, no longer an invisible man, but a small civil servant in the city administration. There, he met Anatoly Sobchak, a law professor, a well-known reformist, and the city's mayor. Sobchak was a man of modern vision, a believer in democratic reform, but he needed someone who was practical, disciplined, and absolutely loyal. That person was Putin. As deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, Putin did not seek the spotlight. He rarely spoke, never courted attention, and avoided the chaos of politics. He worked quietly, always punctual, never drank, and never said more than necessary. One former colleague once said, Putin was like a razor, sharp, cold, and always kept in its sheath. The 1990s were a time of turmoil. Russia had just broken free from the Soviet Union, only to fall into a spiral of corruption and economic collapse. Oligarchs rose to power, controlling media, energy, and even politics. Many people lost hope and left the country. But Putin was different. He watched, silent, patient, just as a spy watches his target before making a move. In 1996, when Sobchak lost his election, Putin lost his job, but not long after, thanks to an old connection from the KGB, he was called to Moscow. From a small-town bureaucrat, he stepped into the very center of Russian power. At that time, Moscow was a place where power could shift with a single handshake. Yet Putin remained the same, quiet, restrained, and absolutely loyal. He worked in the Presidential Property Management Directorate, then as Deputy Chief of the Presidential Staff, and later as Director of the Federal Security Service, FSB, the successor to the very organization where his journey began, the KGB. Step by step, he returned to where he truly belonged, the heart of darkness and power. In 1998, Russia plunged into a severe financial crisis. The ruble collapsed, public trust vanished, and President Boris Yeltsin's government stood on the brink of ruin. Amid the chaos, Putin stood out for three things: loyalty, discipline, and an almost frightening self-control. Boris Yeltsin, Russia's leader at the time, saw in Putin something he hadn't found in anyone else: a man who did not fear. A man who would not betray, and most importantly, a man who understood how the shadows worked. Then, in 1999, Yeltsin made a decision that shocked the entire nation. He appointed Vladimir Putin, a man almost unknown to the public, as Prime Minister of the Russian Federation. All across the country, people asked, who is Putin? Where did he come from? Just 4 months later, Yeltsin announced his resignation, and in his final address, he said, I am stepping down. Because I believe Russia will be in reliable hands. I trust Vladimir Putin. As the year 1999 came to an end, Russia crossed into a new century, and at that very moment, a name began to enter history: Vladimir Putin.
Клянусь, при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации уважать и охранять права и свободы человека и гражданина.
From a low-level official in St. Petersburg, from an unknown KGB agent, he became the chosen one, the man who, in just a few short years, would reshape Russia's image before the entire world, and this was only the beginning. The restorer of Russia. As soon as he came to power, Putin acted swiftly and coldly. He restored order in Chechnya with an iron hand. When Putin entered the Kremlin, Russia was bleeding in the south. In Chechnya, a long, brutal war was raging. Separatist groups had declared independence, terrorist bombings struck across the country, and hundreds of Russian soldiers were dying. In the eyes of the world, Moscow was losing. In the eyes of the Russian people, the central government had lost control. And then Vladimir Putin appeared. No grand declarations, no slogans. He simply said, in front of the television cameras, we will hunt down the terrorists wherever they hide. If they're in the toilet, we'll kill them there. Under his orders, the military campaign began. Thousands of soldiers were deployed, Chechen cities were surrounded, and airstrikes pounded the region for weeks. Western media called it the most brutal Russian offensive since World War II. But in Moscow, people called it a necessary step to save Russia. Putin understood one thing clearly: if Chechnya broke away, Russia would fall apart, and he would never let that happen. For him, sovereignty was sacred. After months of fierce fighting, Russian forces retook Grozny. The city was reduced to rubble, but the Kremlin had won. The rebellion was crushed, and central authority restored. The world called him a ruthless man. But the Russian people called him the one who brought back order. And from that moment, an image was burned into the minds of millions of Russians: Putin, the man who could hold the nation together with an iron fist, but every victory comes with a price, and from Chechnya, the world began to understand, Vladimir Putin would do whatever it takes, to make sure Russia never kneels again. In the fall of 2000, Putin summoned Russia's top oligarchs. Inside a grand hall of the Kremlin, golden light spilled over a long wooden table. 18 of the most powerful men in Russia sat there, the oligarchs who had ruled the country's economy for a decade. They owned banks, oil, television, and even politics itself. They once thought he was merely a temporary successor, a small, obedient bureaucrat, but that day, his voice echoed, short, firm, and emotionless. Putin began to speak. You may continue doing business, but politics, from now on, is mine. He continued, from this moment, you will do honest business and pay your taxes in full to Russia. If you refuse, you have two choices, prison or a bullet. Some of them understood, they could sense the coming storm, and chose to bow their heads to survive. Among them was Roman Abramovich, a young tycoon and owner of the oil giant Sibneft. He believed Putin's words, nodded, and smiled. He said, "We understand, Mr. President." After that, Abramovich paid his taxes in full, and even revealed to Putin how the oligarchs had been evading taxes for years. He withdrew from politics and turned his focus to football, buying the Chelsea Football Club, and found himself a safe ending. Oleg Deripaska, the aluminum king, also bowed his head and agreed to play by the new rules. He said, as long as the state is stable, we will work for the country. And so, he kept his fortune, continued his business, but always under the Kremlin's watchful eye. But not everyone believed, some laughed, thinking Putin was just putting on a show. Boris Berezovsky, the television tycoon, was one of them. He was confident, after all, he had helped Putin rise to power, and thought he could control him. But just days after criticizing Putin publicly, he was forced to flee to London. According to many reports, fearing Putin might send assassins after him, he hired a team of bodyguards, replaced all his doors with bulletproof glass, and whenever he went out, he used 5 cars, each taking a different route. However, he forgot one thing: Putin was trained by the KGB. In the end, no one truly knows why or how he died so mysteriously. Then came Vladimir Guzinsky, owner of NTV, a television network known for criticizing the government. He was detained, later forced to sell his station to the state, and fled into exile in Spain. But the one who dared to challenge Putin most openly was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oil tycoon behind Yukos, and at that time, the richest man in Russia. He believed he was powerful enough to stand up to the Kremlin, but just a few months after that meeting, as his private jet landed in Siberia, police surrounded the plane. Khodorkovsky was arrested, accused of fraud and tax evasion, and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Yukos, his oil empire, was seized by the state. From that moment, there were no more doubts. Putin was not just Yeltsin's successor, he was the true holder of power. In less than a year, he had subdued an entire empire of oligarchs. Those who stayed silent, survived; those who resisted, vanished. And from that point on, Russia was no longer ruled by money. Putin was rebuilding something far greater, the pride of the Russian nation, shattered after a decade of chaos. Under his rule, Russia's economy made a stunning recovery. GDP doubled in just a few years, average incomes rose, and Moscow, once gray and weary, began to shine again like the capital of a great power. The people started calling him the man who restored Russia. But Putin didn't only want to rebuild the economy, he wanted to restore Russia's place in the world, as a global power that no one could ignore. On the international stage, he was blunt, cold, and unafraid to confront the West. He once said, "If a country cannot defend its sovereignty, it will simply disappear from the map." To Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a historical event, it was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, and he was determined never to let it happen again. He strengthened the military, invested heavily in new weapons, and reignited the flame of Russian nationalism, something the world believed had long died. To many Russians, Putin became a hero, the man who pulled the country out of chaos and gave the people back their pride, but to his rivals abroad, he was a dictator, cold, dangerous, and dragging Russia back into the shadows of the Cold War, perhaps. Both are true, because to revive a fallen empire, sometimes you must be ruthless, and Putin knows that better than anyone. Love him or hate him, the world has had to admit one thing: Vladimir Putin made the planet look at Russia once again. When power gathers in one place, darkness begins to spread from there. After subduing the oligarchs, Vladimir Putin no longer had any rivals inside Russia, but power, like fire, the brighter it burns, the easier it consumes the one who holds it. Now, he was no longer just a president, he was the man deciding the fate of a nation standing between two worlds, the West, and the lingering memory of the Soviet Empire. A unipolar world is not only unacceptable, it is impossible. When Putin spoke those words, the world understood. Russia had changed. He openly challenged the global order led by the United States, and from that moment, relations between Moscow and Washington froze over. Border conflicts, spy poisonings, accusations of election interference, all turned Putin into the symbol of the Russian shadow in the eyes of the West, but inside Russia, his image was entirely different. For millions of Russians, Putin was not a dictator. He was the only man strong enough to make the world respect Russia again. Even with his power firmly secured, voices of dissent still echoed within the country. Journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had exposed war crimes in Chechnya, was shot dead in the elevator of her apartment building. Former spy Alexander Litvinenko died in London after ingesting radioactive polonium, and Boris Nemtsov, a leading opposition figure, was gunned down on the Bolshoi-Moskvoretsky Bridge, just a few hundred meters from the Kremlin. 3 incidents, 3 names, different stories, but one message the world understood all too clearly: in Putin's Russia, dissent comes at a very high price. After more than 2 decades in power, Putin had built a system where all authority flowed toward the center, and loyalty became the only currency that mattered. Those who were loyal were rewarded. Those who betrayed disappeared. February 24, 2022, the Day of Destiny. The world held its breath as massive military convoys began crossing the border, over 100,000 soldiers, hundreds of tanks, missiles, and heavy artillery, all moving toward a nation once called a brother, Ukraine. Putin called it a special military operation, meant to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. But the world called it by another name, an invasion. Within days, the names Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol appeared on every news broadcast around the globe. Cities that once lived in peace were now engulfed in smoke and fire. Millions of civilians fled their homes, while Western nations imposed wave after wave of sanctions on Moscow. For the first time in decades, the world was witnessing a full-scale war in the heart of Europe. But for Putin, this was not a beginning, it was the inevitable consequence of 2 decades of confrontation. To many analysts, Ukraine was never just about territory. It was the final battlefield for Russia's influence. Between NATO's expanding reach on one side, and a Russia determined to reclaim its imperial stature on the other. Putin once said, "If the bear is cornered, it will strike back." To him, Ukraine was not just a neighboring country, it was a symbol of Russian history, of the Soviet Union's former glory. Losing it to the West was, in his eyes, an unbearable wound. As the war dragged on, the world split in two: one half condemned, sanctioned, and isolated Russia from the global market, The other half quietly continued trading, or stood in the middle, waiting to see which way history would turn. And through it all, Putin's image remained, cold, composed, sitting behind a table dozens of meters long, facing his generals, giving orders to continue the campaign. But power, once it crosses the line of blood and steel, always demands its price. Tens of thousands of lives lost, an economy in decline, and a Russia more isolated than ever. The world began to ask, is Putin fighting for the security of his nation, or for the legacy of his own power? In the eyes of many Russians, he is still the man who defends their pride, but in the eyes of the rest of the world, he has become the symbol of a dark era returning. And between those two views, one truth remains undeniable: Vladimir Putin has forced the entire world to change. After 2 decades on the throne, Putin achieved something few believed possible. He revived a chaotic Russia after the Soviet collapse, restored national pride, and redefined the country's position on the world map. But to achieve that, he paid a heavy price: isolation, distrust, and the thin line between strength and fear. In 2020, while the world was struggling with the pandemic, Russia witnessed a major political turning point. Putin signed a constitutional amendment allowing him to remain in power until 2036. That means, if he chooses, he could become the longest-serving leader in modern Russian history, even surpassing Stalin. To his supporters, it was the act of a hero, the only man strong enough to protect Russia from the turbulent waves of the West. But to his critics, it was a sign of fear, the fear of a ruler who cannot let go of power. On the outside, the world sees Putin as a symbol of unshakable authority, but on the inside, perhaps only silence remains. The close allies of yesterday have left, the opponents have disappeared, and decisions are increasingly made by only one man. They say, the higher you rise, the lonelier it gets. For Putin, that peak of power might also be the coldest place of all. He still appears calm and composed, his voice steady, his steps firm, as if nothing in the world could shake him. Yet, in his eyes, there are moments when a trace of weariness and contemplation flickers through. Perhaps even he knows, history will not forgive easily. On one hand, he is the man who gave Russia pride and stability after years of chaos. But on the other, he is also the one who left the nation isolated. The one whose decisions have brought suffering to countless lives in endless conflicts. The world once knew him as a man of action, a symbol of power, a man who never backed down. But when night falls over the Kremlin, when the applause has faded away, perhaps only one man remains, a man who still believes that through strength and iron discipline alone, he can keep Russia from collapsing. Yet power is never eternal, time moves on, and history will, sooner or later, pass its judgment. And when people look back, they will ask, was Putin the savior of Russia? Or the one who trapped it in the shadow of his power? The story of Vladimir Putin begins with a boy born in a cramped apartment in Leningrad, where the winter wind slipped through every window frame, and where that boy learned how to survive in a cold and ruthless world. And then, more than half a century later, that same boy would become the man holding the fate of millions in his hands. From the worn steps of a poor communal block to the grand halls of the Kremlin, his journey stands as a testament to the power of will, of discipline, and to the belief that Russia must be great. But along that journey, he lost many things: the trust of the West, the freedom of dissenting voices, and perhaps even the peace within his own soul. To those who love Russia, Putin is a hero, the man who restored national pride and reclaimed the place they believe their country deserves. But to many others, he is a symbol of control, a shadow cast over freedom, and like every great ruler in history, his legacy will forever be divided between light and darkness. Perhaps one day, when he no longer sits atop power, people will remember Putin not just as a president, but as a symbol of Russia in the 21st century, strong, proud, yet full of contradictions and loneliness, because every form of power comes with a price, and the price Vladimir Putin has paid is solitude, upon the throne the whole world looks up to. And you, what do you think about this man? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to follow for the next stories. See you in the next video.